I asked you for ID 3 times. Give it to me now.
You still haven't given me a lawful reason to
You're
demand
refusing
it.
to cooperate.
Refusal during a voluntary encounter is not non-compliance.
I don't need to keep explaining myself.
That's the issue. You haven't explained anything.
A county deputy initiated a stop during a routine patrol and quickly shifted from questioning to issuing commands. He requested identification multiple times. Each request was met with a calm and consistent refusal, accompanied by a clear statement that there was no legal basis for the demand. The deputy interpreted the refusal as non-compliance. His posture changed. He adjusted his position to limit movement and placed a hand near his belt, signaling authority. His tone became more directive. The interaction moved away from inquiry and toward enforcement. The individual maintained steady composure. His responses remained controlled and focused on a single point. There was no reasonable, articulable suspicion to justify the request for identification. He did not raise his voice or introduce new arguments. At that stage, there was no reported crime connected to the individual, no observable violation, and no behavior meeting the threshold for reasonable suspicion. The deputy did not address those gaps. Instead, he repeated the order and described it as lawful. A bystander nearby began recording the interaction. The presence of a second recording device did not alter the deputy's approach. He continued to narrow the exchange into a compliance decision. The deputy moved closer and escalated to detention. He instructed the individual to turn around. The individual complied without resistance. His hands were placed behind his back as directed. The deputy applied handcuffs. The action was carried out in a controlled manner, but without a clearly established legal foundation. At that point, the encounter shifted from a disputed stop to a potential constitutional violation. Following the detention, the deputy began explaining his reasoning. The explanation introduced after the fact did not align with the earlier absence of articulated suspicion. The sequence of actions and justifications lacked consistency. The individual did not argue during the detention. He remained silent and compliant while the deputy continued speaking. The bystander maintained continuous recording from across the street. The deputy's account contained gaps. There was no specific incident tied to the individual, no consistent explanation for the stop, and no established legal threshold supporting the detention. The deputy was not aware of the individual's background at the time. The man he had detained was a retired Supreme Court justice with extensive experience in constitutional law. He understood the legal implications of each step in the encounter and allowed the process to continue without interruption. By that point, the outcome was no longer determined by the exchange on the sidewalk. The interaction had been documented, and its review would depend on the recorded evidence rather than the deputy's on-scene interpretation. The encounter began earlier that morning in a residential neighborhood during routine patrol. The deputy had been assigned to monitor the area following general reports of minor disturbances, none of which were tied to a specific suspect or ongoing incident at that time. He observed a man walking along the sidewalk. The activity itself was ordinary. There were no visible indicators of criminal behavior, no matching descriptions from recent reports, and no calls in progress that would have justified immediate intervention. Despite that, the deputy chose to initiate contact. He approached and asked for identification. The request was made without referencing a specific reason. The individual responded calmly and asked for clarification. He indicated that he was engaged in a routine walk and questioned the basis for the request. The deputy did not provide a clear explanation. Instead, he repeated the request. The tone shifted slightly, becoming more assertive. The individual maintained a consistent response. He stated that in the absence of reasonable suspicion, he was not required to provide identification. At this stage, the interaction remained voluntary. There were no commands to stop movement, no physical contact, and no indication that the individual was being detained. The deputy still had the option to disengage or clarify his reasoning. He did neither. He continued pressing for identification, framing the request as a matter of compliance rather than legal justification. The individual did not change his position. His responses remained focused on the lack of legal grounds for the request. The deputy began interpreting the refusal as obstruction. This marked a shift in how he processed the interaction. Instead of reassessing the situation against legal standards, he moved toward enforcing compliance. His posture became more rigid. He repositioned himself to maintain proximity and control. His language shifted from inquiry to instruction. The individual continued to remain calm, offering no resistance and no escalation in tone. There were still no new facts introduced that would support reasonable suspicion. The deputy did not identify a specific crime, did not reference a credible report, and did not articulate any observable behavior that would meet the required legal threshold. At that point, the interaction had reached a critical stage. The deputy had created a situation where compliance was being demanded without a clear legal basis. The individual, aware of the legal framework, continued to refuse while remaining non-confrontational. The imbalance between authority and justification became more pronounced. One side relied on positional authority. The other relied on legal accuracy. The deputy chose to proceed based on authority. He transitioned from repeated requests to the initiation of detention, setting in motion the sequence that led to the use of restraints captured later on camera. The escalation became more evident once the detention had already taken place. Within minutes, a supervising officer arrived on scene. The response had been triggered by routine radio updates, but the situation he encountered did not align with a standard stop. He observed an individual in handcuffs standing on a residential sidewalk. The deputy was in the process of explaining the detention. The explanation lacked specificity. It did not clearly identify a crime, a matching suspect description, or any immediate threat. The supervisor began asking direct questions. He requested the basis for the stop. The deputy referenced suspicious behavior, but did not provide details that met the threshold for reasonable suspicion. The supervisor pressed further, asking what specific actions had justified the detention. The answers remained general. At that point, the supervisor shifted attention to the detained individual. Identification was requested through standard procedure rather than demand. The individual complied without resistance once the situation had moved into formal detention. The information provided was reviewed. The supervisor recognized the name immediately. The context changed at that moment, but the procedural concerns had already been identified before that recognition. The issue was not the identity of the individual. It was the lack of legal foundation for the detention. The handcuffs were removed shortly after. The supervisor addressed the deputy directly. The discussion focused on the absence of articulable suspicion, the escalation of a voluntary encounter, and the decision to apply restraints without sufficient justification. The exchange remained controlled but direct. The deputy's earlier reasoning did not hold under review. The timeline of the interaction, combined with the available body camera footage, showed a progression from request to command to detention without the required legal threshold being met at any stage. The bystander recording continued during this period. The footage captured both the detention and the supervisor's arrival. It provided an external perspective that aligned with the body camera record. The individual did not engage in extended discussion on scene. Once released, he concluded the interaction without further confrontation. The incident did not end there. Body camera footage was flagged for review as part of standard procedure. The presence of additional civilian video increased the likelihood of external scrutiny. The sequence of events was clear, and the documentation was complete. The matter was referred to Internal Affairs for formal investigation. The Internal Affairs review proceeded using both the body camera footage and the bystander recording. Investigators reconstructed the full sequence, starting from the initial contact through the detention and the supervisor's intervention. The timeline was clear and uninterrupted. The footage showed that the deputy initiated the encounter without identifying a specific crime, report, or observable violation. The request for identification was repeated several times, but no additional facts were introduced to justify escalation. When the interaction shifted from voluntary contact to detention, that transition was not supported by reasonable suspicion. Investigators focused on consistency between what was said in the moment and what was later documented. The deputy's report described the individual's behavior as suspicious. The footage did not support that claim. The individual's conduct remained steady throughout. He walked, stopped when approached, responded calmly, and did not attempt to leave once the deputy escalated the interaction. There were no sudden movements, no evasive actions, and no indicators of criminal activity. The review also examined how authority was applied. Department policy requires officers to clearly distinguish between a voluntary encounter and a detention. A voluntary encounter allows a person to decline requests and disengage. A detention requires specific, articulable facts. In this case, the deputy treated a voluntary interaction as if it already met the threshold for enforcement. That decision shaped everything that followed. Once the deputy framed the refusal as non-compliance, he moved toward control rather than reassessment. The escalation to physical detention occurred without new information. The use of handcuffs further elevated the seriousness of the situation, despite the absence of a legal foundation. The presence of two recordings limited interpretation. The body camera captured the deputy's perspective, including his positioning, tone, and verbal explanations. The bystander video provided a wider view, confirming the sequence and showing the lack of physical resistance. Both sources aligned. There were no gaps in the record and no conflicting accounts that could alter the timeline. Supervisory review became a key point in the evaluation. When the supervising officer arrived, he requested a clear explanation for the detention. The deputy did not provide one that met the required standard. The supervisor identified the issue before confirming the individual's identity. The absence of reasonable suspicion was evident based on the interaction itself. The removal of handcuffs followed shortly after. That action ended the immediate detention, but it did not resolve the procedural violations. The interaction had already moved beyond a correctable mistake. It had become a documented case of escalation without legal support. The identity of the individual added context, but did not change the analysis. The man detained was a retired Supreme Court justice with extensive experience in constitutional law. He understood the legal framework governing the encounter and chose not to argue on scene once the situation escalated. His approach remained consistent from beginning to end. He complied when required and allowed the process to be documented. The case moved forward through formal channels. Internal affairs compared the footage with department policy and constitutional standards. The findings were direct. The detention did not meet the legal threshold. The escalation from request to restraint was not justified by the facts available at the time. Disciplinary action followed standard procedure. The deputy was placed on administrative leave during the investigation. After the review concluded, he received a suspension and was required to complete additional training focused on constitutional limits, lawful detention standards, and de-escalation. The department also reviewed its training materials to address gaps in how officers interpret refusal during voluntary encounters. Supervisors were instructed to reinforce a specific principle. Authority alone does not justify detention. Officers must be able to explain, in real time, the facts that support their actions. If those facts are not present, escalation is not permitted. The documentation in this case made that point clear. There was no dispute over what occurred. The recordings showed each step. The deputy's decisions were visible and traceable. The lack of legal basis was not inferred. It was demonstrated through the sequence itself. The individual did not extend the encounter beyond what was necessary. After being released, he did not argue further on the scene. The matter proceeded through review and documentation rather than confrontation. That decision kept the focus on the process rather than the moment. The outcome remained within administrative and procedural boundaries. The case did not rely on conflicting testimony or interpretation. It relied on recorded evidence and established standards. The conclusions were based on what could be seen and heard, not on assumptions or later explanations. This incident illustrates a consistent issue in enforcement situations. When refusal is treated as defiance instead of a legal right, escalation can occur without proper justification. Once that escalation happens, the consequences extend beyond the initial interaction. They affect accountability, training, and public trust. In this case, the system responded through review, documentation, and discipline. The process did not depend on the identity of the individual involved. It depended on the clarity of the evidence and the standards applied during evaluation. The recordings ensured that the review remained grounded in facts rather than interpretation. If you follow cases like this and want more breakdowns focused on procedure, accountability, and real-world enforcement decisions, consider subscribing.
Hands up, don't move.
This is my house. What are you doing here?
Stop talking and face away from me.
You need to stop and check the address.
Hands where I can see them.
You breached a private residence without confirming the address.
The incident began with an unlawful residential entry that quickly exposed multiple procedural failures. Deputy Keller entered a private home under a warrant that had not been properly verified and confronted a homeowner who was calm, unarmed, and attempting to identify himself. Minutes later, Keller realized the man he had detained was the department's incoming chief of police. By that point, the entry, the commands, and the failure to confirm the address had already been captured on camera. The shouting had already escalated. Deputy Keller was inside the residence with his weapon raised, issuing commands to a man standing barefoot in his living room. The man remained composed. He did not make sudden movements and appeared confused by the situation. Keller continued issuing instructions, demanding compliance and control of the scene. The homeowner attempted to explain. He referenced the address and indicated there had been a mistake. Keller spoke over him and did not pause to verify the information or reassess the situation. This marked the point where procedural control was lost. This incident was recorded from multiple sources, including body camera footage, an interior camera, and a neighbor recording from across the street after the forced entry. The man inside the home was not an uninvolved resident. He was scheduled to assume command of the department within days. Keller was not aware of this at the time. Earlier that day, the operation had been organized quickly. The warrant was processed in the late afternoon. It was classified as a narcotics-related case with no immediate urgency. The address was entered into the system and accepted without additional verification. Sergeant Linton conducted the briefing. The information presented was limited. It referenced a suspect linked to prior surveillance and the possible presence of contraband. No additional confirmation steps were taken, and no one raised concerns during the briefing. Keller volunteered to lead the entry. He had a reputation for being assertive and decisive. He was known for completing assignments efficiently, though he had a pattern of bypassing certain procedural steps. These omissions had not been formally addressed, as outcomes were prioritized over process. The residence was located in a quiet neighborhood. The exterior did not match the expected profile associated with the warrant. The property appeared maintained and occupied without any visible indicators of criminal activity. No one halted the operation to verify the address against physical identifiers, such as the mailbox or property records. Dispatch was not contacted for confirmation prior to entry. The team proceeded with the operation. Entry was executed rapidly. The announcement phase was shortened, and the team breached the door and entered within seconds. Inside, the homeowner was encountered immediately. He was unarmed and did not display aggressive behavior. He attempted to communicate and clarify the situation. Keller interpreted the delay in compliance as resistance. His tone escalated, and he continued issuing commands without reassessing the context. The homeowner again attempted to explain and identify himself. He moved cautiously toward a nearby surface, likely to retrieve identification. Keller intervened and instructed him to stop, maintaining a heightened posture. The rest of the team followed Keller's lead. No one interrupted the sequence or questioned the discrepancy between the perceived threat and the observed behavior. The homeowner was eventually able to present identification. Keller took the identification and examined it. This was the first point at which he conducted a full visual verification. The name and image matched a person he recognized. There was an immediate change in his demeanor. His posture shifted and his tone lowered. Verbal commands stopped. At that point, Keller understood the nature of the error and its implications. Keller did not attempt to explain immediately. He looked at the identification, then back at the homeowner, and then down again. The information did not change. The name on the card was Marcus Hale. Keller recognized it. Hale had been selected to take command of the department following a period of internal instability and public criticism. His appointment had circulated through command staff and internal communications. While not every deputy had met him, his name and image were known within the department. Keller had entered his residence. The shift in the room was immediate. Keller's tone lowered and his commands stopped. The issue was no longer controlling the scene. It was the sequence of actions that had already occurred. Hale remained in place and observed Keller. He did not raise his voice or move toward anyone. He treated the situation as a failed operation rather than a misunderstanding. Once Keller stepped back, the rest of the team adjusted. Weapons were lowered and positioning relaxed. One deputy looked toward the entry point. Another waited for direction. The structure of command inside the room weakened. Hale asked who had authorized the entry. Keller referred to the warrant in the earlier briefing. He did not identify any final verification step. Hale asked for the address listed on the warrant. Keller stated it. Hale directed attention to the address displayed inside the home and to the male visible through the doorway. The discrepancy was clear. The error could no longer be framed as a judgment call. It was a failure to confirm basic information before executing the warrant. Hale continued. He asked whether the occupant had been verified before entry, whether dispatch had been contacted for confirmation, and whether any conditions justified immediate action. He also asked whether the observed conditions at the property matched the information provided during briefing. Keller did not provide responses that addressed these points. He stated that the team had acted on available information and had been securing the scene. He referred to standard procedure. Hale responded that the procedure had not been followed. A lawful entry requires confirmation of address, occupant, and basis for action before force is used. Those steps had been bypassed. One of the deputies moved outside, likely to contact a supervisor. Another remained in place but did not engage further. Hale then asked at what point Keller intended to verify the homeowner's identity, given that the resident had attempted to provide it before and after entry. Keller stated that the resident had not been fully compliant. Hale responded that confusion in response to a forced entry is not resistance. A supervisor arrived shortly afterward. Sergeant Linton entered and assessed the scene. He observed the damaged entry, the team's posture, and Keller holding the identification. He recognized Hale. Linton addressed Hale formally and then asked Keller for an explanation. Keller described the operation, referencing the warrant, urgency, and uncertainty regarding the address. Linton requested the warrant and reviewed it. He compared it to the location. The document did not support the entry that had occurred. The team had entered the wrong residence without completing required verification steps. Hale asked whether all body camera footage was active and preserved, whether access to the scene had been documented, and whether any property inside the residence had been handled. Linton confirmed that the footage would be preserved and that command staff and internal affairs would be notified. The incident had already been recorded from multiple sources. A neighbor had filmed the entry from outside. Another individual had recorded the deputy's presence after the situation changed. Interior footage had also captured the entry and subsequent actions. Hale asked Keller to explain why the homeowner's attempt to identify himself had been treated as a threat rather than as relevant information. Keller did not provide a direct response. The issue was no longer intent, it was conduct. The situation reflected not only an individual error, but also broader procedural weaknesses. The briefing had been limited. Supervision had not required additional verification. The operational approach emphasized speed and control over confirmation. Linton instructed Keller to surrender his body camera and step outside. Keller complied. The incident, along with the available recordings and documentation, reflected a sequence of decisions that failed to meet required standards from initial briefing through entry. The immediate response followed standard administrative protocol. Keller was placed on administrative leave pending review. His equipment, including body camera footage, was secured as part of the initial documentation process. The entry team was separated for individual statements. Each deputy was required to provide a written account of the operation, including the briefing, the approach to the residence, and the actions taken during entry. Internal Affairs opened an investigation within hours. The scope extended beyond Keller's conduct to include supervisory oversight, warrant verification procedures, and team compliance during execution. Sergeant Linton was required to submit the original briefing materials and identify all verification steps completed prior to deployment. The available recordings became central to the review. Body camera footage documented the sequence from approach to realization. Exterior recordings captured the forced entry and the visible shift in posture among deputies once the error became apparent. Interior footage confirmed the homeowner's behavior and the absence of any immediate threat. The consistency across these recordings limited the range of interpretation. The timeline was clear and verification steps were either incomplete or not performed. Commands were issued before identity was established. The entry occurred without confirmation that the location matched the warrant. The department's legal unit was notified. The unauthorized entry created potential civil liability based on unlawful search and detention. The presence of multiple recordings increased the likelihood of external review and formal claims. Command staff conducted an initial assessment of procedural compliance. The warrant itself was valid, but the execution did not align with required standards. Address confirmation had not been completed using available methods. No final verification had been requested through dispatch. The decision to proceed had been made without reconciling discrepancies between the briefing information and the physical characteristics of the property. Attention then shifted to supervisory responsibility. Linton's role in approving the operation was reviewed, including the level of detail provided during briefing and whether sufficient oversight had been exercised before authorizing entry. The absence of a structured verification checkpoint became a focal issue. The conduct of the entry team was also evaluated. Although Keller led the operation, each member had an obligation to identify and raise concerns when conditions did not match expectations. No such intervention occurred. The review examined whether this reflected individual judgment or a broader pattern within the unit. Hale provided a formal statement as both the affected resident and incoming chief. He did not introduce new facts beyond what had been recorded. His account aligned with the available footage and emphasized the lack of verification prior to entry and the failure to adjust once inconsistencies became evident. The incident did not remain internal. portions of the exterior recordings were shared publicly within the same news cycle. The footage showed the forced entry and the subsequent change in deputy behavior. It did not require interpretation to identify the sequence of events. Public response focused on the execution rather than the warrant itself. The issue was not the existence of legal authority, but the failure to apply it correctly. Questions were raised regarding how often similar errors occurred without documentation or external visibility. Within the department, the incident prompted immediate review of active warrants and pending operations. Command staff issued a temporary directive requiring additional verification before execution, including physical address confirmation and real-time dispatch cross-checks. The investigation remained active. Findings would determine disciplinary action, potential termination, and any referral for external legal proceedings. The outcome would also influence policy adjustments under Hale's leadership. The incident established a documented case in which procedural failure was recorded from initial briefing through entry and post-entry conduct. The available evidence defined the sequence without reliance on conflicting accounts. The investigation produced both individual findings and structural conclusions. Keller's actions were reviewed first. The report identified failure to verify the address, failure to confirm the occupant, and escalation without establishing a lawful basis for control. These were classified as violations of departmental policy and constitutional standards governing search and entry. His prior performance history, including documented patterns of bypassing procedural steps, was included in the evaluation. The outcome for Keller was administrative termination. The decision cited the cumulative nature of the violations and the clarity of the recorded evidence. The case file was also referred for certification review, which could affect his eligibility for future law enforcement employment. Supervisory responsibility was addressed separately. Linton received disciplinary action for inadequate oversight. The findings concluded that the briefing lacked sufficient verification requirements and that approval was given without confirming essential details. The absence of a structured verification checkpoint was identified as a supervisory failure rather than an isolated oversight. The entry team members were not dismissed, but each received formal reprimands. The review determined that they followed Keller's lead, but did not intervene when conditions did not align with the warrant. The department classified this as a failure to exercise independent judgment during execution. The department's legal unit prepared for potential civil action. The unauthorized entry, detention, and use of force created exposure under established constitutional protections. The presence of multiple recordings and consistent timelines reduced uncertainty regarding the sequence of events. Settlement discussions were anticipated. Hale assumed command shortly after the incident, as previously scheduled. His first directives focused on procedural correction rather than personnel changes beyond those already determined by the investigation. A revised warrant execution policy was issued. It required mandatory address verification through at least 2 independent methods prior to entry. One had to involve direct confirmation with dispatch immediately before deployment. Any discrepancy between briefing information and on-site observation required a halt to the operation until resolved. A second directive addressed command responsibility during field operations. Supervisors were required to document verification steps in real time and confirm them before authorizing entry. This created a recorded chain of accountability extending beyond the primary officer. Body camera policy was also updated. Continuous recording during warrant execution became mandatory, with automatic audit flags for any entry involving forced access. Footage from these events was subject to routine supervisory review, regardless of whether a complaint was filed. Training protocols were revised to emphasize decision-making under uncertainty. Scenario-based exercises were introduced where officers were required to identify and respond to inconsistencies before taking action. The objective was to reinforce verification as a primary function rather than a secondary step. The department conducted an internal audit of recent warrant executions. The review focused on compliance with verification procedures and identified additional cases where documentation was incomplete. Those cases were re-examined to determine whether corrective action was necessary. Externally, the incident contributed to ongoing discussions regarding accountability in law enforcement operations. The visibility of the recordings ensured that the procedural failures were not confined to internal review. The case was referenced in legal filings related to departmental practices and reform measures. The central issue remained consistent throughout all findings. The authority to act had existed, but it had been applied without the required confirmation. The resulting entry was not supported by the standards governing its execution. The outcome established a documented precedent within the department. Verification procedures were redefined as enforceable requirements rather than discretionary steps, and responsibility for compliance was extended across all levels involved in an operation. For more breakdowns of real incidents involving procedural failure, accountability, and how authority is applied in practice, subscribe to the channel.
Step away from the vehicle.
I already identified myself. Federal Task Force. Verify the credentials.
What are you doing out here?
Active assignment.
Doing what?
Not something I'm explaining on the shoulder when you can verify it in under a minute.
Turn around.
You putting cuffs on me before verification?
Turn around.
A county sheriff conducted a roadside stop and detained a man who had already presented federal credentials, identifying himself as an undercover agent. The decision to proceed with the arrest initiated an internal affairs investigation and ultimately led to a criminal case and a prison sentence. At the time of the detention, Sheriff Daniel Rourke was operating within his county on a routine patrol. There was no active emergency or immediate threat associated with the vehicle he stopped. The driver complied promptly, pulling over in a controlled manner and keeping his hands visible. The driver, Marcus Hale, was assigned to a federal Department of Justice task force and was operating in an undercover capacity. His conduct during the stop reflected standard law enforcement training, with deliberate movements and measured responses. Upon approach, Rourke began questioning without clearly establishing a basis for the stop. Hale responded directly and without escalation. When asked for identification, he produced federal credentials. At that stage, standard procedure would require verification of the credentials and reassessment of the situation. Instead, Rourke continued questioning, focusing on Hale's presence in the area, the nature of his assignment, and authorization details. These inquiries extended beyond local jurisdiction. Hale reiterated his status and confirmed he was engaged in an active federal assignment. His responses remained consistent and controlled. Rourke did not adjust his approach and instead instructed Hale to exit the vehicle. This marked a shift from a traffic stop to a detention scenario without a clearly articulated legal basis. Hale complied and again identified himself as a federal agent. The information was not acknowledged. A second officer, Deputy Collins, was present and observed the interaction. No intervention occurred at that stage. Rourke proceeded with a pat-down search, despite the absence of any observable threat indicators. Hale stated that the detention lacked legal justification. The interaction continued without modification. When asked about weapons, Hale disclosed that a service weapon was secured inside the vehicle, consistent with his role. Rather than prompting verification, this information contributed to further escalation. Rourke instructed Hale to place his hands behind his back. Hale restated his identity before complying. Handcuffs were applied, transitioning the encounter into a custodial detention. Following the arrest, Rourke began articulating reasons for the detention, citing suspicion and non-compliance. These justifications were not aligned with the documented sequence of events. Rourke then ordered a search of the vehicle without a warrant or consent. Deputy Collins hesitated, but carried out the instruction. The search revealed federal equipment and documentation consistent with Hale's identification. The presence of federal materials did not alter the course of action. The situation had by that point escalated beyond a routine stop involving the detention of a federal agent and interference with an active federal operation. Federal agents operate under structured reporting protocols, including scheduled check-ins. Hale's failure to report within the expected time frame triggered internal alerts. Supervisors identified the disruption and initiated follow-up procedures. By the time the roadside encounter concluded, the matter had already moved beyond local jurisdiction and into federal oversight. After the roadside detention, Hale was transported to the county station for processing. At that point, the situation moved from an external encounter into a controlled environment where procedures are documented more closely and decisions carry greater legal weight. Rourke continued to treat the matter as a standard arrest. Hale remained in restraints during transport and was not given the opportunity to contact federal supervisors. His identification had already been presented, and no additional verification was initiated by the sheriff's office. At the station, booking procedures were initiated. This included logging personal details, securing property, and preparing formal charges. The charges referenced suspicion and noncompliance, consistent with the justifications stated earlier at the roadside. Hale continued to identify himself as a federal agent during processing. His statements were consistent with what had been presented at the scene. No effort was made by the sheriff to confirm his status through federal channels before proceeding further. The decision to move forward with booking marked a significant escalation. At that point, the detention was no longer limited to a temporary stop or field investigation. It had become a formal custodial action, with documentation and legal implications attached. During this process, the contents recovered from Hale's vehicle remained in the custody of the sheriff's department. These materials included federal equipment and documents associated with an active assignment. Handling such materials without coordination introduced additional legal concerns. Deputy Collins remained present during portions of the booking process. His earlier hesitation at the roadside did not translate into intervention at the station. The procedures continued without internal challenge. The absence of verification is a key factor at this stage. Standard protocol, when presented with federal credentials, would involve immediate confirmation through appropriate agencies. That step was not taken. Instead, the process moved forward based on the initial assumption made during the stop. Meanwhile, Hale's failure to complete a scheduled check-in began to draw attention from his supervising unit. Federal operations rely on strict reporting intervals, particularly during active assignments. A missed check-in triggers review protocols designed to locate and secure the agent. Initial attempts to reach Hale were unsuccessful. This prompted escalation within his agency. Supervisors began tracing his last known activity, including location data and communication logs. Within a short period, attention focused on the area where the traffic stop had occurred. Coordination efforts began to determine whether local law enforcement had any contact with Hale. At the county level, no immediate notification had been made to federal authorities regarding the detention. This delay contributed to the widening gap between local actions and federal awareness. As the situation developed, the legal exposure increased. The continued detention of a federal agent, combined with the handling of federal materials and the absence of verification, expanded the scope of potential violations. By the time federal supervisors confirmed that Hale had been taken into custody by the sheriff's department, the situation had already moved beyond a procedural error. It now involved multiple layers of potential misconduct, including unlawful detention and interference with a federal operation. The next phase would bring direct federal involvement into the sheriff's office. Federal awareness escalated quickly once Hale's absence was confirmed. His unit identified the last known location tied to his assignment and began coordinating with regional offices. Within hours, communication reached the appropriate federal channels responsible for agent recovery and operational integrity. direct contact was initiated with the county sheriff's department. Initial responses did not immediately resolve the situation. The information provided at the local level did not reflect the full scope of what had occurred during the stop and subsequent booking. At that point, federal authorities moved beyond inquiry and into direct intervention. Representatives from federal law enforcement and oversight divisions arrived at the sheriff's office. Their objective was immediate verification of Hale's status, recovery of federal property, and assessment of any procedural violations. Hale was still in custody when federal personnel arrived. His identification was re-examined and confirmed through official databases without delay. This verification established his status conclusively and eliminated any remaining ambiguity. The detention was determined to be unlawful. Hale was released from custody following confirmation. Attention then shifted to the actions taken during the stop and booking process. Federal investigators began documenting each step, including the initial justification for the stop, the decision to disregard credentials, the application of restraints, and the search of the vehicle. Body camera footage and station records were secured as evidence. These materials provided a continuous record of the interaction, from roadside engagement through booking procedures. The consistency between Hale's statements and the recorded footage became a central factor in the investigation. Internal Affairs initiated a parallel review at the departmental level. This included examination of prior complaints, use of force reports, and patterns in Rourke's conduct during previous stops. The review extended beyond the single incident, focusing on whether similar behavior had occurred in the past. Deputy Collins and other personnel present during the incident were interviewed. Their accounts were compared against recorded evidence. Discrepancies between statements and footage were documented. The investigation identified multiple points where standard procedures were not followed. These included failure to verify federal credentials, lack of probable cause for detention, unauthorized search of a vehicle containing federal materials, and continuation of booking despite available identification. Legal analysis determined that the conduct extended beyond departmental policy violations. Federal statutes were implicated, including provisions related to deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of a federal officer. The case was referred for federal prosecution. At that stage, the situation transitioned from an internal disciplinary matter to a criminal case. The evidence collected during the investigation formed the basis for formal charges against Sheriff Rourke. The federal case moved forward with a focus on documented actions rather than interpretation. By that stage, the sequence of events was already well established through body camera footage, booking records, dispatch logs, and federal verification data. Formal charges were filed under federal law. The primary statute applied was 18 U.S. Code Section 242, which addresses deprivation of rights under color of law. The charge centered on the use of official authority to detain an individual without legal justification, despite clear identification and absence of probable cause. Additional charges related to obstruction were considered based on the interference with an active federal operation. The unauthorized search of a federally assigned vehicle and handling of operational materials became part of that analysis. Rourke's defense relied on standard arguments commonly raised in cases involving law enforcement conduct. The central claim was qualified immunity, asserting that the actions taken fell within the scope of discretionary authority and were based on perceived threat and uncertainty during the encounter. That argument did not hold under review. The court examined whether a reasonable officer, presented with the same information, would have acted similarly. The presence of valid federal credentials, repeated identification by Hale, and the absence of any articulable threat were central factors. The evidence showed that Rourke had multiple opportunities to verify, pause, or disengage, and chose not to do so. Body camera footage played a decisive role. It captured the entire progression of the stop, including the presentation of credentials, the escalation in commands, and the application of restraints. The footage also documented the lack of any behavior that would support suspicion or justify detention. Testimony from federal supervisors confirmed Hale's assignment status, reporting protocols, and the disruption caused by the detention. They established that Hale was operating within the scope of a sanctioned investigation, and that his failure to check in triggered internal response procedures. Deputy Collins and other personnel were called to testify regarding their observations. Their accounts reinforced the timeline established by recorded evidence. The lack of intervention, while noted, did not alter the primary responsibility attributed to Rourke as the decision-maker. The prosecution focused on consistency. Each piece of evidence aligned with Hale's account and contradicted the justifications provided after the arrest. The sequence did not show confusion or rapidly evolving threat conditions. It showed continuation of authority despite contrary information. The defense attempted to frame the situation as a misinterpretation of credentials and a precautionary response to the presence of a firearm. That position was undermined by the recorded exchange and the absence of any attempt to verify the information provided. The court rejected the qualified immunity claim. The ruling emphasized that clearly established rights had been violated and that the conduct exceeded the bounds of lawful authority. The jury deliberated over a relatively short period. The evidence required minimal interpretation. The central facts were documented and consistent across multiple sources. A guilty verdict was returned on all applicable counts. During sentencing, the court addressed the nature of the conduct and its broader implications. The ruling emphasized the responsibility associated with law enforcement authority and the consequences of failing to operate within legal boundaries. Rourke was sentenced to a term of imprisonment. The sentence reflected both the violation itself and the position of authority under which it occurred. In addition to incarceration, he was removed from office and lost eligibility for benefits associated with his role. The outcome extended beyond the individual case. At the departmental level, Internal Affairs completed its review and issued findings related to procedural failures and lack of oversight. Policy revisions were introduced, including mandatory verification protocols when federal identification is presented, and stricter requirements for supervisory review during detentions. Training procedures were updated to address jurisdictional limits and reinforce obligations when interacting with federal personnel. Documentation standards were also revised to ensure that justification for stops and detentions is clearly established at the outset. At the federal level, the case contributed to ongoing discussions regarding coordination between local and federal agencies. It reinforced the expectation that identification and jurisdiction must be recognized immediately to prevent escalation. The incident became a reference point in training and legal analysis. It demonstrated how a routine stop, when handled without adherence to procedure, can develop into a federal criminal case with long-term consequences. For Hale, the outcome confirmed the legal boundaries that govern such encounters. His conduct during the incident remained consistent with training, and the documentation of the event provided a clear record of the interaction. The case concluded with established accountability at multiple levels. It did not rely on interpretation or external narrative. The result was based on recorded evidence, procedural review, and application of federal law. If you followed this case through to the end, consider how often situations like this depend on a single decision made in real time. And if you want to see more documented cases like this, you can follow for future analyses.
What's in the bag?
Snacks. I bought them.
You got a receipt?
Yeah, in my pocket.
Why didn't you show me that first?
You didn't ask me for it first.
Don't get smart.
I told you I bought it.
You've been acting suspicious since I pulled up.
I was just walking home.
What happens when a police officer decides someone is guilty before checking anything, and that someone turns out to be a kid who did everything right? This situation didn't start complicated. It became a problem because of how one officer handled it step by step, in public, on camera, with no real evidence. Before we get into it, comment where you're watching from. And if you follow real stories about accountability and how situations like this play out, subscribe. These aren't rare incidents, they just don't always get seen. This happened early evening in a quiet neighborhood. People were outside, nothing unusual going on. Molly Carter was 12 years old. He lived a few blocks away and was allowed to walk to the corner store on his own. That day was normal. He went in, picked up a drink and a couple of snacks, paid in cash, got a receipt, and left. The store owner, Mrs. Alvarez, saw the whole thing. No issue, no confusion. Just a kid buying snacks and heading home. Malik put the receipt in his pocket and started walking back. Officer Daniel Reeves was driving through the area at the same time. There was no confirmed call tied to Malik. No verified report connected to what he was about to act on. Just his own suspicion forming as he watched a kid walking away from a store. He stopped the car and got out. He called Malik over and immediately started questioning him. What's in the bag? Where did it come from? How did he pay for it? Malik answered clearly. Said he bought everything from the store behind him. Said he had a receipt. That should have been enough to at least slow things down and check. Reeves didn't check anything. He kept asking the same questions in different ways, trying to catch a mistake. There wasn't one. Malik gave the same answers each time. Then Reeves took the backpack and opened it. Inside were snacks and a drink. Exactly what Malik said. At that point, a reasonable officer verifies and moves on. Reeves didn't. He switched focus to the money. Asked how Malik got it. Asked if someone gave it to him. Started building a different angle instead of verifying the first one. Malik answered again. Said it was his money. Said he bought the items. His tone changed, though. You could tell he was getting nervous. He wasn't arguing. He was trying to explain something that shouldn't have needed explaining. People nearby started paying attention. 2 teenagers across the street pulled out their phones. A delivery driver slowed down and stayed parked. It wasn't loud, but it was clear something was off. Reeves noticed the attention. Instead of stepping back and checking facts, he stayed locked in. Mrs. Alvarez came out of the store when she saw what was happening. She walked straight over and told Reeves the kid had just paid. She saw it herself. There was no theft, no missing items, no problem. That should have ended the situation right there. Reeves didn't end it. He changed the reason. Instead of theft, he started calling it suspicious behavior. No details. Just a general claim to justify continuing. That shift mattered. Because now the original reason didn't hold up. And instead of stopping, he adjusted it to keep control. Mrs. Alvarez pushed back. She repeated that nothing was stolen. Reeves ignored that and kept the situation going. Malik stayed where he was. Didn't move. Didn't argue. Just waited. Then Reeves told him to call his parents. Not as help. As pressure. Malik took out his phone and called his father. His voice was different now. Short, controlled. He explained he was being stopped and couldn't leave. Reeves stood there while he made the call, still acting like he had full control of this situation. He didn't ask who the father was. He didn't think it mattered. That was the mistake. Because the person on the other end of that call wasn't just coming to pick up his son. And once he arrived, this situation was going to flip completely. By the time Malik finished that call, the situation had already gone too far. What made it worse was that Officer Reeves still had multiple chances to stop, check the facts, and end it. He didn't do that. He stayed with the same approach that caused the problem in the first place. He kept pressing a 12-year-old kid for answers he had already given, as if repeating the questions could turn a normal explanation into guilt. Malik kept telling him the same thing. He said he bought the snacks at the store behind them. He said he paid in cash. He said he had the receipt. None of that changed, because none of it was false. Reeves didn't move toward the store to verify it. He didn't ask the owner to confirm the purchase in any serious way. He didn't radio dispatch to check whether there had even been a theft complaint. That's the part that matters here. He was acting first and checking later, and once people started watching, he looked more interested in staying in control than getting it right. By then, the whole thing had become visible to the street around them. Two teenagers across the road had their phones out and were recording steadily. A delivery driver had stopped nearby and stayed put. A woman from one of the houses had stepped onto her porch. Nobody was creating a scene. Reeves did that himself. The crowd only formed because what he was doing to that kid didn't look justified. Mrs. Alvarez, the store owner, stayed close and kept trying to correct it. She told Reeves that Malik had paid. She made it clear there was no missing merchandise and no theft from her store. She wasn't guessing. She had been standing at the register. She knew exactly what happened. That should have ended the stop. Instead, Reeves changed direction. He moved away from the theft angle and started calling Malik's behavior suspicious. That's usually where bad stops fall apart. The original reason stops working, so the officer starts reaching for broader language. Suspicious behavior sounds official, but without facts behind it, it's just cover. Malik was still standing there, doing what kids in that position usually do when they know they're not winning the situation by speaking more. He answered what he was asked. He gave his name. He said where he lived. He kept his voice under control. But the tension was getting to him. Anyone watching could see that. He wasn't acting guilty. He was acting like a child stuck with an adult who had already decided not to believe him. Reeves kept the pressure on anyway. He asked about the backpack again, even though he had already opened it. He asked about the money again, even though Malik had already explained it. At that point, the questioning wasn't about getting information. It was about keeping Malik in place and keeping authority over the scene. Mrs. Alvarez stepped in again and repeated that there was no report from her store. No one had stolen anything. No one had run. No one had hidden anything. She was giving Reeves a clean way to back out of it. He didn't take it. He told her to step back and let him handle it. That didn't make him look more in control. It made it obvious he was ignoring the one adult there with actual first-hand knowledge. Another patrol car slowed near the end of the block. The officer inside didn't jump out. He watched first. That usually means one thing. He was trying to figure out whether this was a real stop or a mess he was about to walk into. Reeves never waved him in. He never called for support. He never gave a clear explanation out loud. That also tells you something. Officers speak up when the facts are solid. They get quieter when they know the situation sounds weak the second another cop hears it. Malik looked down the street more than once after that. He wasn't trying to run. He was waiting. That's an important difference. He had called for help because he understood, even at 12 years old, that the truth by itself was not ending this situation. Then a black SUV turned onto the block. It came in normally, no sudden stop, no drama. It pulled up near the curb, close enough for Malik to notice right away. He recognized it immediately. Reeves looked at the vehicle, then went back to Malik, still acting like the scene belonged to him. He had no idea the next person walking toward him wasn't just a parent coming to pick up a scared kid. He thought he was still managing a minor stop. He wasn't, because the man who stepped out of that SUV understood police procedure, understood street encounters, and understood exactly what Reeves had already done wrong before he even said a word. And in a situation like this, that changes everything fast. When the SUV pulled up, the situation didn't look dramatic. But this is where everything actually shifted. Up to that point, Officer Reeves was operating under one assumption, that he was dealing with a kid he could control, question, and keep in place until he decided he was done. No urgency to verify. No pressure to be precise. Just authority carrying the situation. That assumption was about to collapse. Malik's father stepped out and approached calmly. No shouting, no rushing. He didn't come in emotional. He came in focused, and that alone already changed the balance. People who know how these situations work don't react fast. They listened first. He looked at Malik, then at Reeves, then at the store owner still standing there. In a few seconds, he had enough to understand the basics. This wasn't a chaotic scene. It was one officer holding on to something that didn't make sense anymore. Then he asked Reeves what was going on. Reeves answered like he still had control. He framed it as a possible theft and said Malik wasn't cooperating. That's important because at that moment, he committed to a version that didn't match what everyone else had already seen. The father didn't argue. He didn't try to out-talk him. He went straight to structure. He asked what was stolen. That question matters because it forces specifics. You can't stay vague once that's asked. Reeves didn't give a clear answer. Then came the next one. Who reported the theft? Again, no clear answer. At this point, the situation starts to look weak, even to people who don't know procedure. When basic questions don't get direct answers, people notice. The father kept going. He asked if the store confirmed anything was missing. And now, Reeves had a problem. Because the store owner was right there, and she had already said multiple times that nothing was taken. This is where most officers would step back and reset. Admit the confusion, verify, end it. Reeves didn't do that. He switched the reason again, moved away from theft, and called it suspicious behavior. That shift told everyone watching exactly what was happening. He didn't have a solid reason, but he wasn't ready to let go of control. And this is where the father stopped treating it like a conversation and started treating it like a breakdown of decisions. He didn't raise his voice. He just started walking through it. He pointed out that Malik had been consistent from the beginning. He pointed out that the only witness had already confirmed the purchase. He pointed out that the bag was searched before anything was verified. That's not arguing. That's building a record. And here's the part Reeves didn't account for. This wasn't just happening in front of a parent. It was happening in front of multiple cameras and another officer who had now stepped closer and was clearly listening. That second officer didn't jump in. He didn't support Reeves. He stayed neutral. That silence matters. When backup doesn't step in, it usually means they don't agree with what they're seeing. Then the recognition hit. The second officer addressed Malik's father properly, not as a random civilian, by title. That's when Reeves realized who he was talking to. And you could see the shift immediately. His tone changed, his posture changed. The confidence he had earlier, gone. Now he was explaining instead of controlling. But it was too late for that, because the issue wasn't just that he made a bad stop. It's that he had multiple chances to correct it and chose not to. The father didn't react emotionally to the title being recognized. He stayed on the same track. That's what makes it worse for the officer. No yelling to hide behind. No chaos to blend into. Just clear, calm questions in a situation that doesn't hold up. He asked why Malik was still being held there after everything had already been explained. That question didn't have a real answer, because at that point, there was no legal or practical reason to continue. Reeves didn't try to push back again. He couldn't. The structure of the situation was already exposed. The father told him to return the backpack. Reeves did it immediately. That tells you everything about where the control actually was now. Malik stepped back with his father. The tension that had been sitting on him the entire time finally dropped, but the situation itself wasn't over yet. Because what just happened wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a full sequence of bad decisions, made in public, recorded from multiple angles, and now witnessed by someone who not only understood the system, but had authority over it. And once something reaches that point, it doesn't stay on the street. After the street stop, the case went into review. The evidence was simple. Reeves stopped Malik without confirming a theft. Mrs. Alvarez told him the items were paid for. He ignored that. He searched the backpack before verifying any crime. When the theft claim failed, he changed the reason to suspicious behavior. That sequence hurt him. Internal Affairs reviewed the body cam and bystander videos. The footage showed the same thing from every angle. Malik gave consistent answers. The store owner cleared him. Reeves kept the stop going anyway. Then they checked Reeves's record. There were earlier complaints with the same pattern: aggressive stops, weak justification, and escalation before verification. This case had stronger evidence, so the department could not brush it aside. He was removed from duty, then fired. His certification also went under review. That put his future in law enforcement at risk. The department made policy changes after that. Officers had to verify facts faster in stops involving minors. Searches had to be justified before they happened. Supervisors had to review stops where the reason changed during the encounter. Malik was not charged. He kept a clean record. That does not erase what happened. A 12-year-old was treated like a suspect without proof in public, while adults tried to tell the officer he was wrong. That is the point of the story. Reeves did not lose his job because Malik's father was the chief. He lost it because the stop was wrong. It was recorded. And this time the facts could not be covered up. Ask yourself one question. If nobody filmed it, would the outcome have been the same? Comment what you think. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more.
Turn around. We're done talking.
I already identified myself. U.S. Marshal, go and check the information.
You don't get to tell me what to do out here.
I'm telling you what a competent officer would do.
You've been acting suspicious since I lit you up.
No, I pulled over, kept my hands visible, and identified
Step away
myself.
from the vehicle.
This stopped being your start when I gave you federal credentials.
What happens when a deputy turns a basic stop into a power contest in front of the one person on that road who actually knows exactly where that deputy's authority ends? What started as a roadside detention turned into a serious legal problem when Deputy Travis Harlan refused to accept federal credentials from the man he had stopped. That man was U.S. Marshal Adrian Cross. Harlan kept pushing anyway. He kept acting like the badge in his own pocket mattered more than the law in front of him. Before we get into it, comment where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about bad stops, abuse of authority, and officers paying for their own arrogance, like the video and subscribe. This whole thing started because Harlan decided Adrian Cross looked wrong for the area. Cross had just left a joint task force meeting. Plain clothes, unmarked vehicle, normal for his assignment. He wasn't coming from a bar, wasn't driving recklessly, wasn't doing anything that would stand out to any officer who was actually looking for a violation. Harlan still picked his car out and stayed behind him long enough to make it obvious he wanted a reason to stop him. Then he hit the lights. Cross pulled over right away. Safe shoulder, engine off. Hands visible on the wheel. He knew exactly how stops go because he had worked alongside local law enforcement for years. He also knew when the tone was off from the first second. Harlan came up to the driver's side already acting like he had something bigger than a traffic stop. He didn't start with a violation. He didn't say what Cross had done. He started asking what he was doing in the area and where he was coming from. That told Cross a lot. When an officer has a real reason, he usually says it. Speed, lane issue, light out, registration, something. Harlan didn't do that. He went straight to presence. Why are you here? What are you doing here? That kind of stop usually means the officer decided first and started looking for justification second. Cross answered without giving him extra conversation. Then he told him he was a federal officer and could provide credentials. That should have changed the stop immediately. Instead, Harlan leaned into it harder. His tone got sharper. He demanded identification again, like Cross had sidestepped him, even though Cross was trying to identify himself in the clearest way possible. Cross reached slowly and showed his credentials, badge and ID. No sudden movement, no attitude, no reason for confusion. Harlan looked at them and rejected them. That was the real beginning of the problem. At that point, this was no longer about uncertainty. He had been given information that any reasonable officer would verify. Instead of doing that, he stepped back and called for backup. And the way he called it in mattered. He didn't say he had stopped someone identifying himself as a federal officer. He framed it like he had a suspicious subject who was not cooperating the way he wanted. That version started going into the record right there. Cross understood exactly what was happening. He didn't try to win a roadside argument. He stayed calm and let Harlan keep talking. That's what experience looks like. Sometimes the fastest way to expose bad policing is to let the officer commit fully to it on camera and on radio. Backup arrived within minutes. Deputy Marisol Vega came in and read the scene fast. Cross wasn't agitated, wasn't evasive, wasn't moving around. He was standing there, composed, speaking clearly, repeating the same information he had already given. He identified himself again. U.S. Marshal, federal assignment, credentials already shown, available to verify. Vega looked at Harlan because the obvious next move was to confirm it and settle the stop. That was the off-ramp. Harlan ignored it. Instead, he ordered Cross out of the vehicle. Cross got out immediately. No hesitation. No resistance. He kept his hands visible and did exactly what he was told. That point matters because officers like Harlan love to rewrite these moments later. They use words like tens, non-compliant, officer safety, subject behavior. Cross wasn't giving him any of that. Harlan still kept pushing the same questions. Why are you here? What are you doing in this area? Why didn't you identify yourself properly? That last part was ridiculous because Cross had already done it more than once. By then, somebody nearby had noticed the stop and started recording. Phone up, clear angle, enough to catch the broad shape of what was happening. That should have made Harlan slow down and think. It did the opposite. Some officers get careful when they know there's video. Others feel challenged. Harlan looked like the second type. He got louder, more rigid, more interested in asserting himself than fixing the stop. Then he told Cross to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Cross paused for a second. Not to resist, to think. Because once cuffs go on, the whole stop changes. He knew that. He also knew roadside arguments with the wrong deputy can get worse fast, so he complied. He turned around and put his hands behind his back. Vega hesitated. She could see this had gone too far. A man had identified himself as a U.S. Marshal, shown credentials, stayed calm, followed instructions, and was still about to be cuffed because one deputy had decided backing down would hurt his ego. Harlan took out the cuffs and locked them on. That was the moment the case really started. Not when the lights came on. Not when the questions started. When a county deputy put handcuffs on a federal officer, he had already been given every chance to verify, and Harlan still thought he was controlling the scene. He wasn't controlling anything anymore. He was creating evidence. With Adrian Cross in cuffs, the smart move would have been simple. Verify who he was. Slow the scene down. End it before it got worse. Deputy Travis Harlan did none of that. He kept feeding dispatch a version of events that made Cross sound suspicious and uncooperative, even though Cross had already identified himself and already shown credentials. That false framing mattered. Once it goes over the radio, it stops being just attitude on the roadside. It becomes part of the paper trail. Cross understood that immediately. That's why he didn't start arguing now. He had already made the key points. He was a U.S. Marshal. His credentials were valid. They could be checked. Harlan had heard all of that and chosen not to verify it. Deputy Marisol Vega saw where this was heading. She asked Harlan whether dispatch had actually run the credentials. He avoided the question and kept moving. That told her plenty. He wasn't trying to confirm facts. He was trying to protect the stop he had already committed to. Then Harlan asked about weapons in the vehicle. Cross answered directly. He said there was a service weapon in the car and that he was authorized to carry it. That answer should have narrowed the next step. Secure carefully, confirm identity, and stop improvising. Instead, Harlan opened the vehicle and started searching. Cross stated clearly that he did not consent. No attitude, no shouting, just a clean legal answer. calm enough that nobody could honestly claim he was being combative. Harlan ignored him and kept going through the car anyway. He checked the console, dug through the glove box, moved items around in the back seat. It didn't look like a focused search. It looked like someone hoping to find anything that could justify what he had already done. Nothing helped him. While he was doing that, the stop stopped belonging to him alone. One bystander was already recording, then another person started filming from a different angle. That's where officers lose control of the story. Once independent video exists, the report can't carry everything by itself anymore. Vega pressed him again. This time she asked if the badge number had been run. Again, he didn't take the easiest way out. That's what made the situation hard to defend, even before the supervisors got involved. One bad call at the start is damaging. Refusing every chance to correct it is what really buries people. Harlan had several chances to stop the damage. He passed on all of them. Cross, meanwhile, stayed measured. That wasn't weakness. It was discipline. He knew Harlan was building a case against himself, one decision at a time. And the more controlled he stayed, the cleaner that record would be later. Eventually, Harlan found the credentials again inside the vehicle, exactly where Cross had said they were. He looked at them longer this time. Any reasonable officer would have ended it there. He still didn't. He questioned whether they were real. Not because the documents were unclear, because by then admitting they were real meant admitting everything after the first few minutes had been wrong. Vega stepped closer, looked at the credentials herself, and pushed for immediate verification. At that point, she was no longer hinting. She was trying to stop a disaster from getting worse. Dispatch ran it. The answer came back exactly as Cross had said from the beginning. Active U.S. Marshal, valid credentials, no confusion left, no excuse left either. And that left everybody standing there with the same ugly fact. Harlan had handcuffed a federal officer who had already identified himself, already cooperated, and already given him the means to verify everything lawfully. For a second, the whole scene stalled. That happens when the truth finally lands and nobody has a good way to talk around it. Vega told him to remove the cuffs. He did. No apology, no ownership, no explanation that made sense. He just uncuffed Cross and acted like the problem was over because the metal came off. It wasn't over. Cross brought his hands forward. The marks on his wrists were already visible. His car had been gone through. False claims had already gone over the radio. Witnesses had video. Backup had seen enough. The scene had already moved beyond a roadside mistake. Now it was a liability case. Adrian Cross didn't get back in his car and leave, because by then this was way past the point of letting a deputy wave it off and pretend nothing serious had happened. The cuffs were off, but that didn't fix anything. Harlan had already detained him, already searched the vehicle after being told there was no consent, and already fed dispatch a version that made Cross sound suspicious instead of truthful. That part was done. It was on camera, it was on radio. It was in the system. So Cross shifted from surviving the stop to documenting it. He asked for Harlan's full name, badge number, and a supervisor. He asked for the names of the deputies on scene too, not in a dramatic way, just directly, the way somebody asks questions when they already know exactly why they matter. Harlan didn't like that. You could tell. His answers got shorter. He had lost the tone he started with, but he was still trying to act like he controlled the stop. That wasn't true anymore. Once Cross started documenting, the power on that roadside changed. Vega saw it too. She was the one who pushed for a supervisor to come out. That mattered, because if she had stayed passive, Harlan might have tried to write the whole thing up before anyone above him understood how bad it was. Captain Dorsey got there a few minutes later, and the scene already looked terrible before anybody explained it. Cross still had marks on his wrists. The car had clearly been gone through. 2 people nearby were still recording. Vega looked tense. Harlan looked like a deputy trying to hold onto a version of events that was falling apart. Dorsey asked what happened. Harlan answered first, which made sense because deputies like him always try to frame the scene before anyone else gets a clean shot at it. He described it as suspicious activity, non-compliance, concern over weapons, and uncertainty about identity. He was trying to compress a bad stop into a version that sounded defensible if you only heard it once. Then Cross laid it out in order. He said he identified himself early. He said he presented credentials. He said verification was available from the beginning. He said he refused consent to search. He said he was cuffed anyway. He didn't ramble, didn't perform outrage. He just gave Dorsey a clean timeline that made Harlan's explanation look weak. That alone was bad for Harlan. Then Vega spoke, and that made it worse. She didn't do a full public takedown, but she confirmed enough. She confirmed that Cross had identified himself. She confirmed that the credentials had been available to check. She confirmed that the stop escalated before that happened. That was more than enough to tell Dorsey he wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. Now it's about whether the department is about to get dragged into a federal complaint and a civil case at the same time. Dorsey pulled Harlan aside and made a few calls. Cross made calls too. And that's when the stop stopped being Harlan's problem alone. Cross contacted his chain quickly. That matters because federal agencies don't treat this like a normal roadside dispute when one of their people gets unlawfully detained by a local deputy who ignored valid credentials. Once that call went out, the question wasn't whether this would be reviewed. The question was how bad the review was going to be. Cross also took photos before leaving. His wrists, the inside of the vehicle, the way his things had been disturbed. He got the names and numbers of the people recording nearby. Every one of those steps made sense. He wasn't collecting memories. He was preserving evidence before anyone had time to reshape the story. And Harlan had to stand there and watch that happen. That's where officers like him usually realize they misread the entire encounter. At the start, he thought he had found a person to control. Now he was watching a federal officer calmly build a case in front of him, one detail at a time. By later that evening, the first videos had already started spreading locally. Not huge yet, but enough. Local pages, police watch accounts, community groups. People don't need much when the facts are that clean. County deputy detains plainclothes U.S. Marshal ignores credentials, searches vehicle anyway. That headline doesn't need help. Once the video started moving, the sheriff's office lost the chance to manage this quietly. Internal affairs got involved that same night. The legal side did too. That's how departments act when they think the footage may be worse than the report. Nobody waits around when they can already see a lawsuit coming. By the next morning, Harlan was off patrol. That doesn't mean justice. Departments suspend, reassign, and shuffle people all the time. But it did tell you they knew the stop was radioactive. They weren't treating this like a citizen complaint that could sit in a file for a month. Cross spent the next day with agency leadership and counsel, walking through every part of it. The detention, the false radio framing, the refusal to verify, the search without consent, the bystander video, the marks from the cuffs, all of it. That's where the case widened. Because now it wasn't just about one deputy making bad calls on one roadside. Now lawyers were going to ask what Harlan's history looked like, what training he got, what supervisors ignored, and whether this department had seen warning signs before and done nothing. That's where departments start paying real money. Not because one officer embarrassed them, because one officer exposed what they tolerated before the cameras were rolling. Once lawyers got involved, the case stopped being about whether Deputy Travis Harlan had made a bad decision. That part was already obvious. The real fight became bigger than him. The questions changed. What had the department trained him to do? What had supervisors allowed him to keep doing? Had there been earlier complaints that should have put him under review long before he put handcuffs on a federal officer who had already identified himself? That's where county departments start losing money. Adrian Cross and his legal team moved fast. They already had the Bodycam issue, the dispatch traffic. the bystander recordings, the search without consent, and the false framing on the roadside. Those facts were strong on their own. Then they started looking at Harlan's record, and that's where things got worse for the county. There had been earlier complaints, not the kind that automatically end a career, the kind departments usually minimize. Stops that ran too long. Drivers saying Harlan got aggressive early. Reports that didn't fully match what other people remembered. Nothing by itself dramatic enough to force action. Put together, it started looking like a pattern that nobody had seriously corrected. That's poison in a civil case. Because once a plaintiff can show the officer didn't come out of nowhere, the department loses the easy excuse. It's no longer one deputy making one reckless call. Now it looks like a warning sign they ignored until it became too expensive to deny. Internal Affairs reviewed the stop. That part went badly for Harlan, too. The video didn't support the story he pushed at the scene. Cross had identified himself. Cross had stayed calm. Cross had refused consent clearly. Verification had been available early. Harlan kept escalating anyway. Then he used language over radio that made Cross sound suspicious when the actual footage showed a deputy refusing the easiest off-ramp on the scene. There wasn't much room to spin that. The sheriff's office put out a public statement after the story spread further. It used the usual language, matter under review. Commitment to professional policing, full cooperation. People say those lines every time a department gets caught flat-footed. By then, nobody serious was focusing on the statement. People wanted to know whether Harlan was fired, whether the county was getting sued, and how many people had looked the other way before the stop. Cross filed. That's when the county's problem became measurable. His claim didn't just hit Harlan. It named the detention, the unlawful search, the false narrative built during the stop, and the supervisory failures behind it. The case said in plain terms that Harlan had acted like somebody who expected his version to be accepted automatically and expected the man in front of him to submit. He got the opposite. He got a U.S. Marshal who knew the law, preserved evidence, and had the resources to push the case all the way through. Depositions made it worse. Harlan had to answer for the order of events. Why he didn't verify first. Why he treated valid credentials like a bluff. Why he searched after consent was denied. Why he told dispatch Cross had not properly identified himself. Every one of those questions boxed him in. The body cam and outside video kept him from wandering too far, because the footage was sitting there, waiting to contradict him. That's the part officers like him never think about. The stop lasts minutes. The fallout lasts months, sometimes years. And every bad decision comes back in order. Vega's role mattered too. She wasn't painted as the main problem, but she became important to the record because she had seen enough to know the stop was wrong before it ended. Her testimony helped establish that Harlan had chances to correct course and chose not to. That's a brutal fact in front of county lawyers trying to reduce damages. Mistakes are easier to defend than stubbornness. The county knew where this was going before trial. They knew what a jury would see. A calm federal officer in plainclothes identifying himself early, a deputy rejecting that identification, escalating without verification, searching anyway, and then trying to write the scene in a way that didn't match what cameras captured. On top of that, you had prior complaints and weak intervention from the department. That's how settlements get big. So the county settled. It was the kind of settlement that forces a press conference and makes taxpayers pay for one deputy's ego. Cross received substantial compensation, enough that nobody could pretend the county viewed this as a minor mistake. The exact number got attention for a reason. It was massive. Not because money fixes what happened, but because money is the only language some departments speak clearly once misconduct is too public to bury. Harlan was done after that. His career didn't survive the case. Between the investigation findings, the videos, the civil exposure, and the pressure on the department, there was no path back to normal patrol work. The same deputy who had acted like federal credentials meant nothing ended up as the clearest example of what happens when local authority outruns judgment. Cross handled it differently. He didn't turn into a headline chaser. He didn't go on some revenge tour. He did what disciplined people do when they know they were right from the start. He let the record stand. He let the facts do the work. And in the end, that worked better than roadside anger ever could have. The bigger issue, though, wasn't just Harlan. It was the system around him. A deputy with the wrong instincts got enough confidence, enough room, and not enough correction to believe he could override process, override credentials, and override common sense. He did it in front of cameras. That's why people heard about it. The harder question is, how many times officers like that do smaller versions of the same thing when nobody records? That's why this story matters. Not because a U.S. Marshal won, not because the county paid, because the stop showed exactly how fast routine authority turns abusive when the person using it thinks the badge ends every argument. It doesn't. It never did. And this time, the person on the receiving end knew that, proved it, and made the department pay for learning it the hard way. What would you have done?